So in this first mini lecture, I'm actually going to look at framing the research policy study, your framing of it, where are you coming from, where's your research paradigm, it's called, or worldview, and then from there, connecting it to the research question and your approach to the study, and also then where you yourself are coming from. And if you're not claiming you're neutral and objective and that you are somehow implicated somehow in the study, we will look then at your reflexivity. So a really good place to start, I suppose, is a book by Ritzvi and Lingard, and it's called Globalizing Education Policy. And it's a great introduction and start to the whole series of, I suppose, the vocabulary of the policy process. It shows you how you can do policy analysis as a desk study. You never need get up from your desk if you have the right theory, if you have the right approach, if you know where you're coming from, if you have your values worked out and you know what theories you're looking at, you can actually do a desk study, a very good desk study, and a policy analysis of even just one policy. Although often one policy is related to others. You might have a national policy, for example, in Ireland that has a relative in the OECD or a relative in the European Commission. And so it might be a good idea to track all of those as you work your way through. So the policy making process is one then, and then the policy enactment process is another process. So how is policy made? Who are the actors? Which one of them has the most influence? They don't all have equal power. You're talking about the politicians, the economists, the churches. You're talking about parents, guardians, students, educators, researchers, so civil society, community leaders, etc. So they don't all have the same power. The education is shot through with power and privilege. There is a differential power happening in the space there. So it would be rather naive to think each have the same power. And then the policy for implementation in the school, for example, in an education setting, is not happening in a linear, rational way because there's a whole lot at stake in the culture and in the context of schools. And there's much more nuance and complexity and sophistication needed to understand what's actually happening when policy is enacted in school settings. So you have to have an interest to be able to do this kind of study well. You have to have an interest in politics and the cultural politics of society and how everything is set up and run. You can't really study this in isolation from what is happening in the wider world. For example, I like obviously to get my news through the news channels, through newspapers, through podcasts. For example, in Ireland, the Irish Times run a very good podcast on a weekly basis with Hugh Lenihan. I'm very fond of The Rest is Politics in UK, run by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and The Rest is Politics in the US by Kathy Kay and Anthony Scaramucci. So as well as the newspapers and connecting into the news media, I listen to the commentators as well because I want to know what's happening in the world. And I know what Hannah Arendt said in 1954, that if politics changes and if the economy changes, then that will result in a major change happening in the education system. So you need to be able to track those changes and to understand them. And what's very interesting about this particular moment in time is there's a huge number of agencies calling for a new social contract for education in the now and into the future. That, for example, UNESCO has in 2021, just I suppose after the start of COVID, has actually called specifically for a new social contract, and it has had millions of people around the world in different countries working on their ideas for this new social contract for education. What kind of person do we want to educate? What characteristics do we want to bring forth from education? And how will that make a difference to the world we live in, to the planet we live in, to the way we live with one another, the human in relation, rather than the independent, go-it-alone person? How are we to be showing that we're humans in relation, that we're interdependent with one another, with care, justice and equality together? How are we to do that in a world that's fraught with actually, I suppose, injustice, war, hunger, famine, etc.? So how are we to educate people to do something different for a future of uncertainty and to grasp that with hope and transformative possibility. So that's really what's happening there in terms of the international world. And the OECD, in a recent policy study, explained to us that education has mostly concerned itself since the turn of this century anyway, in particular with just producing the pipeline of talent for the world of work. And that pipeline of talent, they've been looking for the abstract thinker, the STEM thinker, the person who can be innovative, design, produce things for the economy and for national security. The purposes of education have been less concerned with who we are as citizens or for building ourselves into strong societies and doing that work of alliances together in diplomacy, and has actually been less concerned with our wholesomeness as holistic persons. Our inner world, exterior world, wherever are we humans animated by spirit or whatever. So that's all that holistic picture. So what we're now looking for you to do is to actually look at this chart here from Cresswell and Cresswell in 2018 and look at it and see where are you positioned. Which one of these worldviews sits in for you very well? I'm happy to tell you I come from a transformative worldview of education because I see the value in education to give, to educate, to lead out with care, to pull people's talents out, to be the best they can, and to contribute that to the world and to the planet. That's the work that I'm involved in research and education. I'm not naive about it. I understand the issues, but I also hold out that transformative possibility. So that openness is needed. So I see education as a perpetually open ethical question that changes as the need arises. In the same way, democracy is never static. It changes as the need arises. So there's politics and power, and there's concerns with care and justice in there, and how to be collaborative and humans in relation together, and how we change the world together and how that will happen. And so the education policy researcher then is analysing from a particular worldview or research paradigm. And once you have that selected, then you're going to have coherence between your question, your positioning, your data collection, your data analysis, and you'll have data trustworthiness then in your findings. You'll be able to share them with the reader. The reader will be able to know where you're coming from. They will be able to say, does this stand up as a scholarly piece of work? And they will be able then, and that will happen through peer review, where all of the journals give you a very strong peer review. So you will get nothing published in the literature unless it is seen to stand up in the literature and have that data trustworthiness. So the other great, question for you then is your own positioning. And I suppose that goes hand in glove with your worldview. So if you're coming from social theory and you're looking at policy through social theory and you're saying, well, that you're a positivistic researcher, that you are coming from nowhere, that you're objective, that you're neutral, that you're not involved at all in any of it, and that you're coming from it with that kind of distance, then there really is no requirement for you to bother with being reflexive or telling the reader where you're coming from. You write in the third person, you stay well away from things, etc. However, positivistic studies since the time of Comte in the early part of social theory has been debunked by lots of traditions. Because the claim is that, well, education is about human change and development, and we're all implicated, we're all humans. And if we're not, we can actually get all of this done by the robots. They can do the analysis because they can be seen to be coming from nowhere, which of course they're not either, because they're programmed in a specific way and with a specific algorithm. So all of the anti-positivistic traditions then include critical pedagogy, critical studies, feminist studies, critical and feminist studies, post-colonial studies. And so in that worldview, I present and do the work of journaling, reflexive work, and I share with the reader in my research where I'm coming from, and I present all of the different approaches that I've used to assure data trustworthiness. A paper here by Wanda Pillow is a great start into understanding this and that connectivity between values, ethics, power and knowledge, and the complexity of that. And of course, we're looking for very knowledgeable young people coming from our school system, and we want them to be able to care for themselves with good human flourishing and personal agency. But we also need them now, particularly nowadays, to have a sense and a felt sense of a collective responsibility for others in the world. And not just only in their own family, but in their wider society. And that felt sense of collective responsibility is a social conscience. And it is actually a social conscience that cares for the environment, the planet, others, humans and non-humans. And so the question for us is, how do we introduce that into education policy? What will it mean in the classroom? How will it be caught, if not thought? And it's a felt sense, so it's not an abstract. It's not in an abstract way. It's not doing it in theory. It's doing it in practice as well. Theory and practice going together, as Freire said, for a praxis.